Hello, class, and welcome to Federal Government. I'm Sarah Cupcho, and this is going to be our first recording. A couple of things. There's a wasp in my house. It's over there. So if you can see me looking at it, I'm just trying to make sure that I don't get stung. So this week we're going to be focusing on kind of the fundamentals, excuse me, and the foundations of government, and we're going to build on that. There's a couple of things that I'm going to be saying throughout the semester that you would have heard here first, so it's kind of important that you understand it. So let's move on. Let's start. Okay, so what's happening here is that we are looking at the understanding of government in and of itself. What is government? If we were in class, I would go around the room and ask you guys, what do you guys think government is? What is government for? Why does it exist? Could it theoretically have a society in which it doesn't exist? But since we're not there, I'm just going to go ahead and let you know that the understanding of the term government that we're going to use for this course is that it is the institutions and procedures through which we are ruled or have sovereignty over us. The institutions and processes that implement authoritative decisions that mitigate the way that we behave on a daily basis for a state. Okay, they could be laws, regulations, but we are, as citizens, required to obey those. Okay, so then what is politics? The decision-making process of that government. The decision-making or the process by which we form those authoritative decisions, or as Harold Laswell says, who gets what, when, and how. The wasp is getting closer, guys. I'm not going to do anything about it. So, in a nutshell, it gives us a way to solve these disputes over power. Should I do something about this wasp? I'm just going to cover it up. There. So, moving on. Then what does it mean to be in a state? And when I say state, and throughout the course, when I say that word state, I'm not referring necessarily to one of the 50 states or the 50 nifty. What I'm referring to is any territory that has a population in which there is a government that has sovereignty over that population and has diplomatic recognition from another state. So, in order to be a state proper, you have to have a territory that it has a population, and that population has a government that has sovereignty over them, and there has to be recognition from another proper state. If you are missing one of those 5 elements, you're not considered a state proper. It's what's called a fail state. So for example, Venezuela recently had a governmental overthrow. So while there's a territory that has a population and a government that has sovereignty over that population, the United States, from our perspective, does not necessarily recognize the newly formed government as legitimate, and therefore the United States does not recognize that government as legitimate, or that state as legitimate, which means it is not referred to as a state, rather a fail state, okay, because they don't recognize the method by which that government came to power. Please send me an email if that's confusing. Okay, so we are going to break down the different forms of government. Oh, look, it's a typo right here. That's a bummer. I worked really hard on making that normal. Okay, so there's several different variations of government. We know that we have a Republican form of democracy, and I'll explain that later, but we know that there's also other types of government. So, according to who governs, if you have a single person governing over the entire territory, there's 2 different variations of that. That could be a monarchy, like a king or a ruler, or it can be a tyranny, right? A dictatorship of some kind. Then you have a form of government in which several people, or the few elite class, govern. Something like an aristocracy or an oligarchy. This is when you have usually wealthy landowners would be the ones. And then there's the many. The many is going to be considered a polity or a democracy, but But you'll also note that the bad variation of the many is the democracy. Well, I guess we're not in class right now, so I can't say why do you think that is, but think about it. Why do you think we can put a democracy in both the good variation of government by the many and the bad variation of government by the many? I'll give you a minute. Because there's this saying, too many cooks in the kitchen, which means that at some point it could turn into a mobocracy, right? Too many people interjecting their thoughts and opinions about government policies, okay? I have some other examples here of different forms of these kind of governments. Autocracy would be something like the United Arab Emirates, North Korea, Saudi Arabia. Oligarchies would be like Ukraine or the Russian Federation. Democracies would be like the 193 other democratic countries that exist in the world. However, those are not necessarily pure democracies. In fact, I think I have a slide on it. I do, so I'm going to hold tight. Most democracies that you'll see today have something similar to what we have, which is a representative form of democracy. Moving forward onto the forms of government according to where the limit is placed, that is, who controls the distribution of power given to the government, can be classified in 3 ways. Also, totalitarian governments are governments that don't recognize any formal limits. They control everything, and if perhaps there is an institution that exists to put some sort of cap or barrier on the power of the government, that institution is then absorbed by the ruler. Okay, it's something like Henry VIII, right? He wanted a divorce, but he had to be approved from the church, and so instead of allowing the church to place a formal limit on his power, he simply absorbed them. That would be some sort of totalitarian government. Anywhere where all of the formal institutions are governed by the single person. Then there's the authoritarian governments that have very limited or no formal barriers on power, but they can be constrained usually by another institution like the church. Okay? And then constitutional governments. These are where we have formal and effective written down limits on the power within government, something like what we have. Okay, so this is the slide that I was referring to a second ago. The difference between a pure direct democracy, which can be argued as being a bad variation of rule by the many, and representative democracy. Okay, direct democracy gives every individual citizen the ability to vote on all of the laws and all of the policies, which sounds great, but there are thousands books that are like this thick of laws and policies, and we are not necessarily equipped with the knowledge or skill to be able to have a educated, informed decision on all of that. And so what ends up happening is that these direct democracies end up dying violently because people don't necessarily do or vote what's best for the community. They vote what is best for them, which is not necessarily the way to have a thriving society. So our founding fathers came up with this crazy idea of forming a representative democracy or a representative republic, a republican form of democracy. Any of those, they all mean the same thing. And that essentially says that instead of having everybody come together and vote on all of the laws, we all, regular citizens, go out and vote for a representative to go to Washington or go to Austin and represent us. These people theoretically are supposed to be looking at the greater good. They're supposed to be more enlightened, more educated, and be able to filter out common interest or, filter out individual interest and look only at common good. They don't necessarily do what's best for them. They do what's best for society. I'm saying all of this in theory because we know that sometimes things get a little bit murky in water. So, did the founding fathers actually think of these things by themselves? They didn't. Hint, hint, they had help. They were the smart ones. This wasp is really freaking me out. I hope I don't die today. So, the founding fathers did have a lot of influence. Namely, with our specific governing documents like the Articles of Confederation, the Declaration of Independence, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and the Constitution itself, the influencing philosophers behind those documents were Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. This is not exclusively. We have other people like Rousseau, Machiavelli, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato. All of these different people had influence, but the ones that you can see most availably are going to be Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. So let's take a look at those gentlemen. The two documents written by these philosophers, which are very, very good documents. At some point, if you're a political science major, you're probably going to have to read at least part of these. Oh my God. Did you guys see that? I almost died just now. That would have been the end of me. So, John Locke writes a book called The Two Treatises of Government. Thomas Hobbes writes The Leviathan. And they are very similar, but also have extremely different tones. Okay? So, let me see if I have some of that. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke lived not too far apart from each other. They overlap just a little bit, but there's a lot of different things going on. Thomas Hobbes lived during the English Civil War. Okay, so he kind of watched people live in destruction in the midst of wartime for his entire life. And so he says that if you take away all the rules and the regulations and society and all of the societal constructs that we live through, people have a natural state, and that state is called the state of nature. And the way that people behave when you are in the state of nature, that is, without any laws or regulations or things to mitigate the way you behave in society, they will tend to divert back to being very archaic. He believed that man in the state of nature, men and women, behave very self-interestedly. They don't do what's best for other people, they do what's best for them. Man without government is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Very a war of all against all. The state of nature is an ugly place, according to Thomas Hobbes, that you do not want to be. But without government, that's where you are. John Locke, on the other hand, existed in a slightly more harmonious time, and he says, well, you know, it's not that bad, Tommy. Man in the state of nature they're not necessarily bad, but they don't have any complex knowledge. They come into society in a state called the tabula rasa, or empty state. Okay, they have no knowledge. Knowledge is derived from different forms of things that you know. So there's complex knowledge is derived from simple knowledge. Things like a coin is gold, hard, shiny, and in that way, not necessarily bad. I'm sorry, the wasp. Not necessarily bad, but empty. And because people are biased, they can't be the judge of their own cause. And so in that way, the state of nature is not ideal. And people should want to join society in order to leave the state of nature, just so that they don't have to be the judge in their own cause. Okay? Okay, so moving forward, why would people want to leave the state of nature, and how does that process take place? People leave the state of nature for two reasons. We know that Thomas Hobbes says it's because the state of nature, where there is no government or society or social constructs, is because everything's horrible. It's an all-out war of all against all, and you need to leave that in order to make sure you don't actively die. Secondly, John Locke says, well, it's just more convenient to not live in the state of nature. You can't be the judge in your own case. And in the state of nature, even there are still laws of nature, right? So we would leave society then to ensure our individual rights. We don't have to worry about protecting our life, our liberty, our property. We form a government, leave the state of nature to form a government to do that for us, okay? Locke believes that the goal of government and the extent of government is to protect our individual rights to life, liberty, and property. And that's it. We consent to form government to protect these things, and that's the extent of government. And so in Locke's world, government is extremely limited. The wasp is getting closer to me. Is this one of the situations where if I leave it alone, it'll leave me alone? I'm gonna go with it. So, okay, excuse me. This theory that government, we leave the state of nature to form a government is called the social contract, okay? The social contract posits the idea that people create government by entering into agreements to live together under a specific form of government, okay? So they say, we all come together in the state of nature and agree to live under a form of government. We allow government to govern us. Government is not imposed on us. And we will relinquish a certain number of our rights in order for government to protect them for us. You can have my right to not do whatever I want to do, and I will follow your rules, okay? It's binding that we are obligated to do certain things, and government is obligated to do certain things, okay? The terms of this, according to John Locke, will, we give our right, only a few rights, life, liberty, and property, over to government, and that's what they exist to protect. And if they protect our life, liberty, and property, we promise to obey their laws and regulations, okay? Thomas Hobbes, on the other hand, had a different understanding. Thomas Hobbes believed that we relinquish almost all of our natural rights to a sovereign in order for them to protect those rights. We relinquish everything except our ability at self-preservation. The only way that government would have exceeded its bounds under the contract, according to Thomas Hobbes, would be if that dictator or the king was actively trying to kill us. So it identifies with this idea of self-government. We give our consent to be governed, and thereby, this is an important thing, government derives its legitimate authority to govern us by the consent of the people to be governed. Okay? I tell government, you can have my rights to life, liberty, and property. You can have those in order to protect them. I promise to follow your rules. If you do not make some sort of agreement, verbal or non, written or non, that's called tacit agreement, then the government doesn't have legitimate authority over you. Okay? Government is not imposed upon you. You form a contract with government. They protect your life, liberty, and property. You are bound by the obligations and duties of citizenship. Okay? The government has the responsibility to provide safety, security, and public goods, and we have a duty to obey the law. However, I don't know where the wasp went, but I heard it. However, how much we give to our government differs. Thomas Hobbes say we give lots of our rights over to government because people at our core are naturally self-interested, and given the opportunity to think for ourselves almost, we will denigrate into a society of war of all against all. John Locke doesn't believe that. John Locke says, well, it's just simply more, what's that word for, my son doesn't sleep through the night, so I often get forgetful of certain words. Parents understand. It doesn't matter. Let's move on. Okay, so based on this theory, you go back one, the founding fathers of the United States saw the social contract, they read these documents, and they said, you know, that is the proper role of government. Government, especially under the two treaties of government, should exist to protect our life, liberty, and property. And in the second treaty of government, John Locke also says that if government no longer serves that, if government has exceeded that, we as citizens have the right to dissolve that union and form a new government. In fact, many of you guys are probably familiar with the Declaration of Independence, but the first paragraph is essentially ripped off from that document. So after having read that, our founding fathers come together and they they are using the ideas that they have heard in those documents, in the Leviathan and in the two treaties of government, to draft the Declaration of Independence, which is a philosophical document giving our, as the colonies, understanding of government to the King of England, to explain to him, we feel that government exists to do X, Y, Z, and you are infringing upon our rights and not doing those. And in keeping with these two documents, the Leviathan and the two treaties of government, we have the right then to dissolve our union and declare independence. Okay, and so they did just that. It was approved on July 4th. It's a philosophical document stating that we have certain rights that cannot be taken away. If you attempt to take those rights away, we are going to dissolve our union and be independent. Okay? So, let me give you a for example. The Declaration of Independence has a couple of paragraphs that are almost direct reflections of John Locke's two treaties of government. I'm going to read from it now. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, the colonies. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and then to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and the laws of God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind require that they should declare the causes which impel them to separate. This is him saying, we feel as though there are certain laws that have been infringed upon, and when that happens, we are going to dissolve the union. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and they are endowed with their Creator with certain inalienable rights, rights that cannot be taken away, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, although John Locke calls it the pursuit of property. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That means that we believe government exists. We have created a government so that you will protect those inalienable rights, life, liberty, and property. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent to be governed. We say that the government can govern us. We establish consent to the government, which gives it legitimate authority to protect those inalienable rights. Derive their just power from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute a new government, laying its foundation on the principles and organizing its powers in such a form that they shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Okay, what he's saying in the Declaration of Independence, largely written by Thomas Jefferson, is that we believe that there are certain rights given to man from God, the ability or the life, liberty, and property. Well, he says life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but John Locke, which we know he basically plagiarized from, says property. And that to secure those rights, to make sure that we continue to have those rights, we, the citizens, have given government the authority to protect us. We have given our consent for government to govern us in the pursuit of protecting our inalienable rights. And that if government then exceeds that or becomes destructive of the pursuit of protecting our inalienable rights, we as citizens have the right to dissolve those bonds and institute a new government that lays its foundation on the principles of a limited government that exists to protect only our life, liberty, and property, or inalienable rights. And the type of government that we institute should be pursuant of those causes as well. So, that was a lot. Please let me know if you don't have a firm understanding of that. It is a lot, and I will post more resources to see if you're unable to, if you can't seem to understand it, totally understand it's a big thing. So, the United States then formally adopts the Articles of Confederation as our first governing document in 1777, and it was our first written constitution until 1789. It was not good. It did not have a lot of structures and functions necessary to have a society that was going to last a long time. It only had one chamber of commerce. the execution of the laws was left to individual states, and it was very problematic. So there were four main weaknesses associated with the Articles of Confederation. There was no power to regulate money or tax people, which was very, very difficult because at the time we had a lot of war debts, and it was important that we have money to pay France back for helping us. There was only one branch of the legislature, and each state had one vote, so there was a lot of disproportion within Congress. And there was a lot of very rigid rules. But the fundamental weakness, the most important deficiency within the Articles of Confederation was the principle of state sovereignty, is that there were too many, it was a confederation rather than a federation, which I'll explain in my next PowerPoint. Excuse me. It was more like a friendly alliance of states than it was one unified nation, which was extremely problematic. So my man James Madison I named my daughter after him. No shame in my game. Who writes this document called The Deficiencies of the Confederation. And he outlines one by one all of the deficiencies that he finds within the Articles of Confederation that ultimately will lead to the demise of the newly formed United States. And there's what I just said, the trespasses on the rights of other states. There's no cohesion in matters that require it. But most importantly, along with the principle of state sovereignty, the people never ratified the Articles of Confederation. And this is important to remember. James Madison says that the Articles of Confederation are not legitimate governing documents because the people never ratified them. The people never signed off and agreed to let the government, as established under the Articles, govern them. So if you remember a couple of slides ago, I said government derives its legitimate authority from the consent of the people to be governed. And in this case, the people never consented to the Articles of Confederation, and thereby making it illegitimate. This wasp is a bane on my existence. I went just downstairs just now, and look what I got. The zapper and the spray. It is on. Okay, so let's move on. We know that the first Constitutional Convention was in Annapolis, and it didn't have a lot of traction. There was a lot of states that did not want a convention of states to revise the Articles of Confederation. However, after a number of events took place. Oh, it's just a gnat. It's not the wasp. After a number of events took place, including Shays' Rebellion, a constitutional convention was called to revise the Articles of Confederation. Excuse me. In May 1787, a number of delegates from 12 states met to revise the document. And there was a couple of things. At the convention, we have three groups competing for influence: the anti-nationalists that wanted to hold on to their individual state sovereignty, the state equality nationalists that usually were from smaller states that wanted to make sure that they maintained some influence in Congress, and the majoritarian nationalists who wanted a strong central government. Were all kind of competing for influence. And the things that they were trying to navigate between was the issue of state sovereignty versus a national government and how to balance that power, the issue of a small state versus a large state and how to apportion that in Congress. I'm sorry, I got a text message just now from my hairdresser. The cultural differences between the North and the South in terms of the economy and in terms of slavery, how they were going to apportion slaves. But most importantly was the executive branch. The executive branch was extremely contentious because they didn't want anything that resembled a king. They wanted to ensure that whatever form of executive they have was the least likely to encroach on other people's power. So you guys are familiar mostly with these. You have the Virginia Plan, that was presented that contained a lot of elements that you'll see today. It had 3 branches of government, proportional representation, which means that that Congress, the bicameral legislature, would be based entirely off the percentage of people within those states, which was controversial because that means that larger states had more power and influence in Congress. So it essentially favored larger states like Virginia. Small states stood to lose a lot of influence. So the New Jersey plan was then presented, which is a lot different than what you'll see now. It did only have 1 chamber in the legislature, and it gave every state 1 vote regardless of their size. It did give more power to the federal government, like the ability to raise funds through taxation, which is very important because we didn't have a way to pay France back. So that was something that was extremely important. And the executive was congressionally elected, and it was a 3-person panel. So that's something that's different. Problem there was equal representation essentially took away a significant amount of power from larger states. And people were also very weary of having a strong central government. So what you'll see happening is the Great Compromise. It's also called the Connecticut Compromise or Sherman's Compromise. It's essentially presenting us the foundation or blueprint for our current political system. You'll see your bicameral Congress, which has 2 houses. One, the House of Representatives, is based on population, while the Senate is based on equal representation. Every state has 2 senators. Okay? It introduced the very controversial 3/5 compromise in order to rectify the population of slaves within the southern nations and make sure that there was equal representation, and I say that with extreme sarcasm. And essentially is forming what we're going to see today. Okay? The executive was a big compromise. It was a 1-person chief that sat for 4-year terms, but it did allow them to be reelected by the Electoral College, which was a great filter for making sure that the person selected to be president would not become tyrannical, and it allowed for a veto, an executive veto, but that veto is non-absolute. There is ways to get around that through checks and balances. So some of the most important and intuitive provisions that accompanied the newly formed government as methods to ensure that no branch of government would become too powerful and there would be ways to mitigate their behavior was the implementation of separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism as a way to protect individual liberty. We saw a moment ago how we drafted a document largely formed on the understandings of government from John Locke's 2 treaties of government, limited to protect our individual liberties. However, Thomas Hobbes had a lot of influence on these protection mechanisms. So Thomas Hobbes, if you remember, said that man was necessarily selfish and that if given the ability, they would absolutely try and seek their own self-interest. Men at their heart were not kind. And so ways that the Founding Fathers accounted for this in these documents, the governing documents, were to incorporate a lot of protections, methods by which people could not gain more power and thereby creating a less limited government. Separation of powers, which gives each branch specific and enumerated functions within the Constitution, but also checks and balances, mechanisms by which if any one of those branches, as they believed it would, sought to encroach on another branch's power, there were ways that they could be checked and balanced, and that power would never be able to encroach. So essentially, if one branch is trying to encroach on another branch and the other branch is also trying to encroach, they would end up checking each other, and we'll look at that. Ratifying this document was extremely controversial. There were 2 groups of people that were arguing against. There were the Federalists that really wanted the ratification of the Constitution. They favored a stronger central government. Then there was the Anti-Federalists that felt that the federal government, as articulated under the Constitution had far too much power and not enough protections for individual rights and liberties. And so they would go back and forth fighting between trying to get states to ratify or not to ratify these documents. And the following slides essentially have the two arguments between them. But what's important is that the Federalists wrote in support of the Constitution the Federalist Papers as pamphlets to distribute and essentially propaganda for trying to get certain states to ratify the document. And they went back and forth explaining why they formed the government in the way they do. And it's an extremely valuable set of documents that we have today, known as the Federalist Papers. The Anti-Federalists also wrote these documents, but they're far less interpreted today. They're essentially opposing the ratification of the Constitution. The prominent Federalists that you're going to be familiar with are James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And they together wrote under the pseudonym Publius to advocate for the ratification of the Constitution. Here's just some slides that'll show you some of the arguments between the two. We know that eventually the document was ratified with the inclusion of the Bill of Rights. The Anti-Federalists acquiesced, and once we included the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution to ensure individual rights and liberties beyond what was listed in the Constitution, it was then ratified, and this is the timeline by which that took place. So that's the first slide. The first PowerPoint. It was an awful lot of stuff, and I know that. Others aren't going to be as long, but please remember also that this is the first 3 chapters. So what normally would be 16 weeks was done just now in like 45 minutes, maybe a little longer. So I will post another, the second half of this lecture discussing federalism later today if I can get my little kids to be cool. Oh, there's the WASP. I gotta go, guys. Email me with questions. I'll see you in office hours. Wish me luck.